Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Take your seats, please. I will open the morning session of the INTERARCH 2018. We will start with architect Richard England from Malta, who is laureate honoris causa in architecture from University of Architecture, Civil Engineering and Geodesy. And from this afternoon, he will be also Doctor honoris causa in architecture from VCU Leuven-Caravel in Sofia. The architecture of Richard England occupies a particular niche in broader history of Mediterranean modernism. His work blends traditional Maltese typologies with the memories of centuries of architecture from vernacular throughout the classical and into the strange, dreamlike, painterly and literary works of the Scirocco and Calvino. England's influences ranges throughout music, art, and literature. All the arts feed into a body of work which embraces drawing, sculpture, and poetry, as well as architecture and design. Ladies and gentlemen, architecture Richard England from Malta.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to be back again on this stage, and I look up at that notice over there and I see that it is 30 years. 30 years is a long time. I was here for the first meeting, and I think I attended every occasion of the International Academy of Architecture, having missed only one because of a medical operation. Now, 30 years implies that, in a way, I belong to an age when apples and blackberries were fruits, and a mouse was a little rodent with a grey tail. So time passes, and in the meantime, the world is no longer the world of optimism which I had as a child when I grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, the future seemed to be extremely positive. Now we seem to have a slightly more darkened possibility of what the future holds for us. Now, I think it might be necessary to start off with a few definitions. Definitions of architects. I have defined an architect as a self-made man who worships his creator. And I'm afraid, somehow or other, over these years, the public at large have seemed to have lost their love for architects. I remember a very famous book by Tom Wolfe, From Bauhaus to Our House, and that was translated, the Italian version, as Maledetti Architetti. There's another Italian book, which was by a guy called Clementi, and that says, Gli architetti dovrebbe ammazzarli da giovani. So, all in all, we're not a greatly loved profession, but it is our duty to try and reinstall to the world, which has become dry and has also become a globalized, similar atmosphere all over, to try and bring back what the architects of the past had. You know, Einstein said, the ancients knew something which somehow we seem to have forgotten. Those were the days, the people who built the pyramids, the people who built the great temples of Egypt, somebody like the architect Senenmut, the people who built the Neolithic temples of my own land, somehow or other seem to be magicians, shamans, and myth makers. It is necessary today for the architect to find once again that role, to fill up and to give what we need to enhance the human spirit and also give life to our soul. I shall start off by showing some of my works, because I have always believed that at the end of it all, it was the great Argentinian poet and author, Luis Borges, who said, "My business is to weave dreams." Borges has also another great saying, which I firmly believe in. He says he was blind and he traveled, and somebody once asked him, "But why do you travel if you cannot see?" The answer, I think, applies very much to the architectural world. It is more important to feel a place than to see it. So my attempt has always been to create an architecture of once upon a time, an attempt to sort of lyricize the spaces of everyday life. I won't particularly mention what each project is, but the idea has always been to create quiescent dreams in borrowed time. And this, in a way, is a search, a personal search, to create what I would like to term personal Arcadias, instead of what dominates today, which is, of course, monetary utopias. So I mentioned before the architects of the past. So in a way, I believe that although we have so much to learn, I think there is also a tremendous amount which we must not forget and remember. Since architects today seem to be mostly involved in money-making speculation, what was once a road to enchantment has now become a route to speculation. I'm also very interested in what one could call the absent presences, because the void, like the silence in a poet or the silence in music, one of my favorite American beat poets, Bob Kaufman, had said, "It is the silent beat which makes the drum beat." And it is, again, the void in architecture which is so important. Again, it's light and shadow. So, in a way, I have always searched for an architecture which evokes the literary tales of these great authors like Calvino, Tolkien, Ockery, Borges himself again, and C.S. Lewis. So they are dream worlds which somehow recall, perhaps, this is a little garden, I have to make a reference, this is a little garden which is called the Garden of Apollo. And the idea is, again, to try and draw inspiration from not only the literary tales, but also the great pictorial work of the great master, which I admire so much, the Greek-Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico, and his great, wonderful piazzas. You know, if architects can create a threshold between reality and dream, then I think that is essentially our job. For our job is to make the ordinary absolutely extraordinary. Now, again, can we turn architecture into, as Schiller once called it, frozen music? I prefer the word liquid silence. And in a way, it is, back to one of my favorite books. And this is one of the things. I regret that I don't see many students, but I would have loved to have told the students that you need to read. You need to read these lovely books. One of the greatest books, it's a fairy tale, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince. And the prince receives a present from the fox as he's departing, and he says, "It is only with the heart that one can see correctly. That which is essential is invisible to the eyes." And, we have to sense architecture. There's a wonderful book by a great friend of mine, Johanni Palasma, which is called The Eyes of the Skin, where he says that you sense architecture with all your senses. You smell architecture. I smelt architecture when I went to see Peter Zumthor's vase in Switzerland. The timber, the smell, the aroma gave it a specific warmth. And then you obviously see architecture. And then there's this wonderful phrase which Palasma uses, and he says, "When I was visiting the Parthenon, I had this great urge to taste the marble." So architecture for me is to provide holidays for the spirit. For buildings, we must remember, are also homes for the soul. Gio Ponti, with whom I had the privilege of working as a student architect for 2 years, used to say, love architecture for its silence. And he said, man needs every day his daily fable. And every morning he would recite the Lord's Prayer, and besides asking for the daily bread, he would pray for a daily fable to enrich his heart. So we must remember, and I think this is essential, that in the words of Alvar Aalto, the wish of every architect is to build a paradise on earth. So in a way, again, the words of a great architect who was one of my great inspirations, Louis Kahn, they said that joy is the key word in our work. Now we move from what I have termed silent spaces. This is a water chapel in one of my recent projects, where you've got this floating platform and the empty cross with a risen Christ. Now, from the silent spaces, we go to sacred spaces, from the secular to the sacred. And here, it is a question of the architect measuring against the unmeasurable. And of course, Antonio Gaudi, who knew a little bit about building churches, has always said that the greatest challenge for the architect remains, above all, the church. Because the threshold, the threshold between the secular and the sacred is by no means an easy step to take. Religion must be seen today not as a source of conflict, which unfortunately it is, but must be seen as a force of peace. The word itself, religion, comes from the Latin relegare, which means to join. So we must make sure that we can do that. Because at the end, I'm a practicing Catholic, and although science teaches us how, these are the inspirations of this particular church, and science, I was saying, teaches us how, it teaches us where, it teaches us when, but it does not teach us why we are here. Only the leap of faith, perhaps, can give us that answer. You know, the threshold between, as I said, the secular and the sacred is an important space in any sacred building. It is a moment of reflection. It is a moment of cleansing. You either wash your feet or wash your hands, because to step from the outside chaotic world, especially the one we live in today, is a big, big step towards understanding what in fact remains, as I said before, unmeasurable. Throughout history and prehistory, funnily enough, the buildings which remain, and in fact we could write the whole history of architecture through the panorama of sacred buildings, but always man paid his homage to his god, gods, or even pantheon of gods. And most of the architecture is not dedicated for man as a living creature, but either to those gods or to the afterlife. It is a truism to say that man knows least about what matters most. So the sacred buildings somehow reflect the way man understands the gods in a particular time. Because I've always believed that architecture is about time, and it is more importantly about place. Architecture today in the global world has lost the sense of place. And place has all the memories, the stratification, almost in a geological way of strata, of what the place is really all about. One of the things which also interests me is that somehow or other we need to create, in my house I've done it, is a little temple where one can meditate. Not necessarily a chapel, but you know, I have built many houses, and all my clients come and tell me, this is where I want my television, this is where I want my books, this is where I want my collection of records or whatever it is they collect. But nobody has ever asked me to provide a space for the spirit. Of course, if you travel to Japan, that is an essential part of the ambience and environment of a living domestic space. You know, we must not ever forget that this is another church, completely different church, much larger, which makes it extremely difficult to create a sense of the sacred. Another thing which we must never forget is that architecture is mood manipulative. I used to give my students a space to design which would irritate them. Equally difficult is to create a space which lifts and enhances our spirit. But I'm a great believer that one of the essential qualities which one can put into an architectural work as an architect is love and dedication. Mother Teresa has this wonderful phrase where she says, "It is not so important what you do, but how much love you put into the doing." So, you know, it remains extremely difficult to create a sacred space. But it is a privilege which I have had over many, many years of creating a number of these sacred spaces. And these are projects which never materialized, and I call them frozen embryos. They might be brought back to life, but you know, something which has struck me, which is absolutely extraordinary, is the fact that architecture which is manifest, projects which actually exist, are liable to immediate change. The moment the architect hands over the project to the client may decide to open a door, to paint the walls different color, and if the land happens to cost more in terms of monetary gain, demolish the building and build a more speculative and money-making edifice. So it is extraordinary that the rendering, which today has become, unfortunately, the way which we sell architecture, and with all its operatic skies and reflective streets and transparent glass, which is only transparent if there's a stronger light behind, seems to be permanent. Nobody would touch a painting, nobody would touch a sculpture, nobody would add a verse to a poem, nobody would add a chapter to a book. But with real architecture, nobody hesitates. But in the rendering, somehow or other, the image is permanent. This was a little project, a troglodyte project, which I dug into the rock on the island of Malta, looking out to this rather mysterious island, which in the ancient days was an altar for the Neolithic temples, and in later days was used as target practice by the army and the air force, which makes you question which of the people of which time were the primitive people. There's a lovely legend on the little island of Gozo next to Malta, which says that a chapel once sank into the sea, and many, many years later, fishermen had their anchor stuck, and they descended and actually found this chapel underwater. So on the site, I'm proposing just a cross, and just to make the legend real. Again, back to myth-making gestures. Now, this is a project which I had presented to the Malta government for this year, because this year happens to be that the capital of Malta is the cultural capital of Europe. That is the city of Valletta. One of the things which has always worried me is, we're back to religion now, that religious wars are almost more common than actual wars about territory or power. The extraordinary thing is that the wars of religion are not, in fact, wars between believers and non-believers, but even more ironically, believers in the same God, because the major components of this system of not coming together are the three monotheistic religions. So I suggested a project where we had a mosque, a synagogue, and a Christian chapel. Since most of these conflicts are on the Mediterranean shore, and Malta is in the center of this Mediterranean region, I thought it would be apt that this project, in a way, builds out a hand of friendship. You're not going to get the three religions to come together, but it is a hand of friendship where, in fact, you can somehow or other. This is another church which is at present on the drawing board and waiting for the approval of the Archbishop, who, when I showed it to him the first time, said, "Well, it looks very unsettled." And I said, well, perhaps it represents the state of the church at present, which of course didn't get me any brownie points. Once we're talking of sacred spaces, I must tell you this little lovely anecdote. Amongst the commissions which an architect gets, you occasionally get a commission to create a mortuary chapel for somebody. So I created this mortuary chapel, and we built it, and the client was very, very happy about it, and he wrote me a letter. He said, "Dear Richard, thank you for the wonderful design of this mortuary chapel. I'm so delighted that I'm dying to move in." So, again, that's the interior of this church. This is another project on the same level as the Triangle of Peace, which is an arena of interfaith. And this is the project of the Chapel of the Rainbow, which we are going to build, which I'm glad to say was a prize winner in this year's competition of the International Academy. So, before closing, I would like to take this opportunity of welcoming Amadeo as our new president, and I wish him luck in achieving, I know, all the dreams he has. We are in very good hands. And I also want to pay homage to my friend Georgi Stoilov, who was, in fact, the greatest catalyst for architecture and architects that I have ever come across. Thank you both, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.